So my name is Susie Gordon, and I work for the city's Natural Resources Department. I'm going to just sort of give you a little preview of what the agenda is tonight. We have a speaker who's going to give you a fairly in-depth presentation about how to compost. But if you know me, you know I can't get away without talking a little bit about trash. And the reason the city's Natural Resources Department is very interested in helping people learn about composting, it's a really important way to help folks keep their trash, reduce the amount of trash they send to the landfill. And it's an important technique, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of it. So you may not know, but our trash, we've got a couple of landfills in the area, the landfill that Larimer County operates, as well as one that is a private landfill out in Alt. Any ideas? Anybody want to hazard a guess as how much of our waste stream is biodegradable kind of food waste and compostable material? Any guesses? Yeah, it's at least 20%, and it's probably a little more. Because you can actually take wood waste and grind it and turn it into a compostable product as well. So as I mentioned, composting is an important strategy that we hope people will consider applying to their own households. But we want to make sure that you're also aware that the city has a very strong recycling program. If you're not already using the services of your trash haulers, curbside recycling services, by all means give them a call, because that's part of your basic service at no additional fee. And recently some changes have happened to the ordinance that sort of prescribes that program. One is that you can call your trash hauler now and get a much taller, larger recycling bin. It's either a 65 or 95 gallon cart. So if you haven't already heard about that, it's a big upgrade from the little curbside tubs, the little open tubs. And then there's sort of a big change that's happened that might sound a little bit unimportant, but they've removed any additional fees. So your trash bill should be very transparent now, and you'll be able to see the price of your trash. So we are interested in composting as a way to help you reduce your trash and therefore your trash bill, because the city's pay-as-you-throw program is structured so that the more you throw away, the more you pay. But it also creates this really important resource for all of us who are interested in doing any sort of gardening or cultivation. And you're going to hear about that tonight. You may already know it really helps promote healthy plants. If you simply use mulch, it's a great way to keep weeds down. And then from the city's perspective, another really important thing is that as you add these biodegradable, compostable materials to your soil, it really reduces your irrigation needs. So you might consider backyard composting, and that might be why you're here tonight. And we'd also like to mention a couple of other options that you have available at your household. Increasingly, we're seeing that the organic growers are interested in getting things like leaves that people rake up in the fall. So I've put the website up there for something we call the leaf exchange in the fall. If you have a whole lot of leaves in bags that you don't want to send to the landfill, there are people who would like to come and take them away for you and use them in their operations. There are two commercial composters who you can patronize. One is Weitzel's on West Mulberry, the other is Hageman's on East Prospect. And if you have the way to get your compostable material out there, it's cheaper than going to the landfill. And then finally, one of our local trash haulers, Gallego Sanitation, who has a booth here tonight, does offer a weekly curbside yard waste collection program. And so you're wondering, how well is this all working, the city's efforts? And it is having a very dramatic impact. So because I'm kind of a little bit of a data nerd, I put these numbers up. In 2009, we are down to 160,000 tons of trash. And that's really amazing because since 2004, what are we down? That's from 230,000 tons down to 160. So it's really going in the right direction, and the recycling is increasing. We're up to 75,000 tons a year that we can document, and that's up from 58. So it's all going in the right direction, and we think at this point the city is at about 38% waste diversion, but we're really striving to get to 50%. So keep on thinking about your recycling options, your source reduction, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with an introduction for Addie, but let me make two quick announcements first. One is that we have a composting festival on June 5th and 6th that will be held at the Gardens on Spring Creek, which is very close by on Center Avenue, and you'll hear more about this a little later in the program. A chance to come and see all sorts of booths. There are going to be, I think, we've got about 30 booths and some more workshops, and we really hope that you'll consider coming over and enjoying it. It's going to be a lot of fun. There'll be music, activities for kids, and hopefully good weather. The second thing is we're going to be giving away prizes tonight, so we hope you filled out a little door prize drawing card. And Michelle is out in the front. If you haven't filled out one already, please send it. Fill it out for her. We've got a green cone. We've got a soil saver composting system, and John Anderson has donated a couple of his starter kits for vermiculture. And so, our speaker tonight, Addie Elliott, is here from CSU, where she is one of the teachers in the soil science program. She is the coordinator for the CSU Organic Agriculture Program. She's the executive director for the Colorado Organic Producers Association, and she's a graduate of CSU, which is always great. She's very experienced in researching and teaching, and she's a new mom. So please help me welcome Addie Elliott.
Good evening. It's good to see a full house who's interested in compost. It's my favorite topic to talk about. So thank you for coming and listening. And hopefully many of you are already composting. Is anybody already composting? Raise them high. Good. I'm going to try and keep this presentation a little short so we can ask questions and have some answers. I know sometimes people have one specific challenge with their compost bin, and we can talk about those as a group and hopefully get them solved. Feel free to stop me if you have a burning question, and I'll have some times where I ask you questions to try and relate to your compost experience. So as Susie said, I'm going to talk to you about backyard composting, but a lot of these principles can be used in different scales. So if you're trying to compost the manure from a horse, or many cows, or a couple goats, or just your kitchen scraps, many of these principles will apply to all of them. So it's kind of a fun science that you can then take to the art form to figure out how it can be used in your specific situation. And all of those materials I just listed, plus any other organic matter, it's such a resource. So it kills me to see it being wasted. We just moved in October, and for a little while I didn't have a compost bin set up, and so I was throwing things in the garbage, and it felt like I was throwing away such resources. So hopefully you feel that way too. There are many methods of composting. One of them is active windrows. That's a long windrow that you lay out in your yard or in a horse yard, or depending on the scale, and then you actively manage it, actively turn it. So we'll refer to that in this presentation. We also have bin compost operations or bin compost setups, and that's what many of the backyard composters are using. We'll talk about that too. There's also a passive windrow system where you can build a pile and have some pipes under it with some forced air that kind of acts as a turning system, but you physically don't turn it. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but just wanted to put that out there in case you're ever interested. That is a system that works and has technology connected with it. And then, as Susie mentioned, John Anderson over here is the worm man in town and the worm expert, but I wanted to put a couple websites up there in the presentation so you can find more information on that if you're interested. So many of you probably already know, but I wanted to list a few of the benefits of composting. My favorite is that it reduces your waste stream that I will no longer call a waste, I will call a feedstock, because it's much more important than the word waste references it as. But it will reduce your material by 30%, so you can reduce your trash pile. Composting also minimizes pathogens and weeds, odors, and insect problems. If you're doing it right, compost should not smell bad. And you really shouldn't have insects attracted to it more than just the few good ones. Like like some pill bugs. There's some ants in my compost pile right now, but they tend to come and go. It's not an ant haven throughout the whole season. Also, composting stabilizes nitrogen and phosphorus, so it turns those two nutrients into compounds that are more able to stay in the soil. They're in a form that the soil can absorb and hold on to until your plant is ready to use them. So that's really good, especially in times like right now when we're getting significant rainfall and the water's moving across the soil pretty quickly and down through the soil. Composted nutrients tend to stay in the soil where you put them, so they're not running off into water bodies or leaching down into the soil or into the water below the soil. Composting also produces a really useful product. So all of us are making something that we could either sell or use, or if it's in my backyard, I always end up adding my compost to the lilacs, and we have really good lilacs because my vegetable garden just doesn't need any more for now. And then we all hear about carbon sequestration. It's in the news, it's in National Geographic, it's everywhere. If you are composting your food scraps, you are sequestering carbon. You are putting carbon back in your soil and keeping it where it needs to be. And people do ask, through turning a compost pile, you do emit some CO2 into the environment, but that's very small amounts, and it's what would happen anyways. So you're doing a net good thing for the planet. So what is composting? This is a definition that's taken out of a really good resource, which is referenced at the bottom. And a lot of this book is available for free online if you go to this link, so I suggest you visit it. So composting is the managed biological oxidation process that turns very unlike material into a like material, like particle, like size, like nutrient holding material. We'll go through this definition one piece at a time so we can define each little piece of it. So the managed portion of this definition, that's what you do. You're the manager, you're the farmer of the compost pile. So you're going to provide carbon and nitrogen at a 30-to-1 ratio. This is like the recipe for a compost pile. Give or take, it's not so much like baking bread. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's more like baking your favorite non-baked good. You can fluff a little bit and it's still going to work. So carbon is a benign product. It's the brown stuff in your waste stream. So it's your brown leaves, it's spoiled hay, it's cardboard, newspaper. It's anything that I like to think if you set it out in the backyard and it gets rained on a little bit, in a couple of days it's not going to be really stinky. So it's pretty dead stuff, the brown stuff. Now the nitrogen is the really alive and smelly and active material, like kitchen food scraps. You might have chicken waste, you might have a chicken coop and have lots of chicken poop on your straw. That's probably more nitrogen than carbon since it's going to be stinky and ammonia rich. Also alfalfa, anything green out of your pastures, or horse manure, that's got a lot of nitrogen in it. So this is the trickiest part for a lot of people, to figure out what is their carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that link that I gave on the previous slide will tell you what the carbon and nitrogen ratio is for your materials. Unless you have something really, really strange, and then you can probably Google it. But coffee grounds, they're high nitrogen, so we'll talk about some more of those as we go. So back to managed, what do? You provide the right recipe of carbon and nitrogen. You also provide the oxygen for the pile. Just like you and I have to breathe, eat, and drink, the microorganisms that are doing this composting process need to breathe, eat, and drink. So we have to give them the food, carbon and nitrogen, the oxygen at about 50%, 5 to 50%, and then we need to keep the pile at about 50% moisture. If you're like me in this semi-arid environment, that's the hardest part, because we all want to save water, we all want to save on our water bill, but we have to remember that the microorganisms need water in order to do their job. So you might be wondering, how do I know what 50% moisture is? If you stick your hand into the middle of a compost pile and pull out a big handful and you squeeze it, not a death grip, but a good squeeze, between your fingers, you should see a little film of water rise up between your fingers. That's about 50%. You can err a little bit on either side of that, but the microorganisms need water like we do. So if you don't water your pile, those microorganisms are still going to be there. They're just going to be more in a dormant state, so they're not going to be acting or being as active as they need to be to do the process as quickly as we might hope. So the biological piece, this is what the microorganisms do. Many of the species of bacteria and fungi metabolize that carbon and nitrogen. So they eat the materials that we put in there, and then they grow and they reproduce, and then they die and they decay, and during the time that they're growing and reproducing, they use that water and that oxygen. And they're also really active, so that's what's giving off the heat. Sometimes I've heard folks say, do I need to build my compost pile in the sun? Well, it doesn't hurt to do that, but these microorganisms are so active, it would be like all of us getting up and running around the room for 20 minutes. We would increase the temperature in this room. So that's where the heat comes from. So if your pile's not heating, the microorganisms aren't busy. So that's something to remember. And then again, remember that composting is farming those microorganisms, and you don't really need to add those microorganisms. They are floating by right now in the air. And if we just put a pile of compost here, they would be there. So oxidation, this is again, the word means in the presence of air, and the microorganisms need the oxygen to respire, and the oxygen sits in the pore spaces between the materials and the compost. So you have to start thinking about what are you putting in that pile. You don't want it to be all sawdust, because we know sawdust compacts down on itself and is really dense. Same thing with just grass clippings. Have you ever seen the grass mold? It just kind of packs down and is hard to break apart. You have to think that oxygen and water need to sit in those pores, so you have to create your pile with a bunch of very different sized particle material. So think of tennis balls and golf balls and bowling balls and all the sizes of pores in between where those balls sit on top of each other. That's what you want your compost pile to look like. So you can use bulking material to maintain that pore space. A good bulking material is leaves. I think I've got a picture here. This is actually Kathy Duskin in the back. This is her leaf pile she uses throughout the winter to make sure that she keeps the right amount of pore space in her pile. I tend to put all my leaves in bags, put them in the back corner, and use them throughout the winter, because leaves are a really important and easy thing to use. They're really light compared to some of the other compostables. So what you're trying to make is a heterogeneous organic matter. What you're using to make compost is heterogeneous organic matter. These are the feedstocks, the different stuff. Heterogeneous just means different in size, different in type, different in physical and chemical characteristics. So these can be kitchen scraps, which we suggest no meat or cheese or bones. A tiny, a little bit of shredded cheddar, because you are making a pizza. If it gets into your compost bin, it's fine. You don't have to be crazy about that, but just try not to get too much meat, cheese, or bones. And that just takes longer to compost. And also different organisms are here to do that. And you don't necessarily want those organisms in your pile. Bedding, if you bed chickens or goats or horses or anything, that bedding is compostable. Waste hay, spoiled feeder grains, leaves, grass clippings, yard trimmings. Does anybody have any other kind of material they're wanting to compost that's not up here that you may be questioning? Can it be composted? The question is little branches. So if it's just going to take longer. If it's any bigger than, even I just trimmed my roses, my little roses, and I didn't put that in there mainly because I don't want to stick my hand in there later and the thorn get me, or I will have to sift it out later. So I have a kind of pile in the corner of my yard with my little yard clippings, and they do decay over time, but I don't tend to put them in my compost bin because you'll end up pulling them out later. Dandelions. I definitely put all of my weeds in my compost pile if they do not have their seeds on them. So mature seeds I put in the garbage can. You know, I'm not sad to put a little bag of fluffy dandelions in the garbage can, but any of the leaves, roots, if the flowers are not fully matured into seeds, I put all of that in my compost bin. And I think you can probably vermicompost the weed seeds. John Anderson's shaking his head, so maybe you need both systems going. Pet hair will decompose. Yes, that's fine. The fluffy stuff off the aspen seeds, I would think that's aspen trees. I think that'd be fine. I would just think that very few of those seeds are going to make it, and if they do, then they're probably not going to be germinated just fine and in the right soil temperature. Aspens are tricky to germinate versus dandelions. I would be more likely to put that in my compost bin. The question was sod, pieces of sod. It would be fine to put in there. My thought would be that adding all that soil is going to make your compost heavier to turn. So the more soil you add, the heavier your compost is. And you might have to just break it up. That sod's going to want to grow, but it will compost. So just weigh your battle. Yes? No, soil will be fine in your compost pile. It just makes it heavy. I would almost make compost on the side and then mix it into the subsoil afterwards, just so you don't end up moving it to the pile, turning it, and moving it back to the same spot. We're trying to save our backs, right? Okay, one more. Yeah. Paper towels are fine. The challenge with that is making sure they stay wet enough so they don't blow away, because we definitely have wind here. So any kind of paper or bills or newspaper, anything you put in there, just make sure it stays moist enough. That's also really good in a worm bin. So what you're trying to make is a like-particled, fine-particled, humus-like material. So homogeneous means everything in the handfuls looks pretty much the same. The final product you're aiming for has so many uses. It might not look this perfect right away. Sometimes when you purchase compost, it's been screened. So the eggshell bit that's a little bigger than the screen will be screened out. So even if it doesn't look perfect like a bag of compost, I still put that in my garden because it will continue to break down, and it's also more food for the microorganisms in the soil. So how do you make compost? You can make it at any scale with all of your backyard garden tools or with front-end loaders and big scarab turners. You need to choose a site. A mowed area is best, smooth or slightly sloping, and you want it to be near your feedstock source. Again, save your back. You don't want to have to carry things all the way out to the back 40 if you don't have to. If you manage your compost pile nicely, it shouldn't smell, it shouldn't be ugly, so that would be more convenient for you. You also want it to be near water. Again, this is the hardest part in Colorado, so if it's hard to get the water there, chances are it might not get watered enough. But then you want it to be 100 feet from a well or waters of the state. So if you have a creek running through your property or an irrigation ditch, you don't want any runoff from your compost pile to end up in there because it is nutrient rich, and that can cause some pollution in those water bodies. So near water, but not right next to a river. And you want to try to control run on and run off. If you have a real sloping property, you can put a hay bale on either side of the slope so that water slows down as it's coming through and maybe gets caught in the pile, and any of the exit water will get caught in the hay bale. This again is just keeping nutrients in your pile instead of them running off into other parts of the property. So this is not a good location for this compost pile. See that big puddle? That's waters of the state. That's anytime it rains a lot and water collects, this is just probably a very small little pond, and any nutrients that get into there are going to leach down into the soil. So just a picture of what not to do. So when you want to build your pile, you want to loosely add your carbon and nitrogen. I like to either mix it up all on a big tarp or on a big flat area that's easy to turn on, or you can do a bucket of this and a bucket of this, and just do kind of a lasagna layer if you don't want to have to physically mix things. If you're doing your kitchen waste and leaves, and you're kind of building your pile slowly, that is the best way to do that, is use the lasagna layer. Just every time you add your bucket of kitchen scraps, add a couple buckets of leaves. You want to think about that carbon and nitrogen ratio. So on that link, the food scraps carbon to nitrogen ratio is listed, and then whatever you'll use for your nitrogen or your carbon will also be listed. So you can just kind of get your feel for what is my carbon to nitrogen ratio. Yes? The question is, what do you do if you don't have any leaves? People seem to have a lot of spoiled hay and straw around. If you have any friends that have that, or check in with the feed stores, put an ad up on FreeCycle or Craigslist, or the city has that leaf exchange. They might still have some access to people who have leaves in their yard that want to get rid of them. So there's probably tons of brown stuff out there. You just have to think about who you're going to contact to borrow it or get it. And then, in the fall, think about if you want to compost throughout the winter and summer, and think about your system for how you'll save your leaves if you have trees. Yes?
Would leaves include pine needles?
The question is, would leaves include pine needles? Pine needles do decompose. They have a really thick resin in them, so it takes a long time for them to decompose. I don't rake my pine needles specifically to add to my compost bin, because again, when I stick my hand in there, they hurt. And they don't decompose very quickly, so they pretty much end up in my garden where I'm digging and planting seeds. So if you can keep your pine needles somewhere else, they seem to be better there. So you're going to add your carbon and nitrogen, and then you're going to add your new material in the same ratio. So if you figure you're adding a 5-gallon bucket of vegetable scraps and 2 5-gallon buckets of leaves every week, then in the future keep doing that. And you want to add water every time you add your materials if you are finding that it's not wet enough. And through this addition process, you're going to be adding oxygen because you're not packing your compost down. So it's just like making a cake, right? This is what happens inside the compost pile. The red area is actually where the microorganisms are the hottest, or the temperature is the hottest, the microorganisms are most active. The outside area is possibly dry, more dry, or if it's a cool day here, the cold air is going to blow through and cool off the pile, so any of that heat that's being given off by the microorganisms might be blown out, and the heat does help with the decomposition. So you have to think, when you do turn your pile, when your pile gets big enough to where there's some thermal mass, where it's like 2 feet by 2 feet or 3 feet by 3 feet, then there is a central portion that's going to be able to stay hot. Once that happens, you're going to be able to graph it, and I'll show you how to do that so you know that your pile is actually working. Once that temperature decreases, it's going to be time for you to do something with it again. So we'll look at that. But just remember that only the center is really where it's most active. So over the process of composting, you need to get all of the material from the exterior part of that pile into the center. That's why turning it's really important. So you want to monitor the pile. And everybody who wants to compost should have a nice composting thermometer. They sell them on this website. They have them at Ace Hardware. I've seen them in other places. It's not really a meat thermometer because you probably need it to be lower temperatures. I've heard a candy thermometer. Candy thermometer would work because it goes to the right temperature, but it might be more expensive than just a compost thermometer. So again, heat is an indicator of biological activity, and I'm a data nerd, so I like to graph it. I just have a piece of paper by my compost pile, and I kind of watch the temperatures increase and decrease so that I can recall what's happened. once you've built 20 compost piles, you can't remember if it's this one you remembered that detail about or the last one. Oh, Susie's got a compost thermometer. So what you might notice about this is it's long enough to actually go down into the pile, and a meat thermometer might stop where my fingers are. So it's not going to get down into the red hot zone of the pile. So you want to get something that's about this length or longer. They are sold in longer increments. After the pile temperature decreases, you want to turn it to reintroduce that oxygen and add water if it seems like it's not hot anymore. Because once you've built the pile with the carbon and nitrogen, basically oxygen and water are the two things that are going to be used up and need to be replaced. So there is a thermometer in a pile, and I've lost a couple thermometers, so you might want to put a long orange cord on it or spray paint it neon green or whatever you want to do, just so you don't end up buying 4. And again, this is another picture from a friend. Even in the winter, composting organisms metabolize enough to produce heat. So if you have your pile built and it's working, then you should see that it's keeping the snow melted, and the melting snow is going to add the water that it needs. So here is a graph of what a typical compost pile could look like. So you see the top triangle dotted line. That could be representative of the first measurements you take right after you build the pile. So you see basically along the bottom is the number of days from turning. So along the left there, it's 1 day, then 2 days, and it goes out. And along the y-axis is temperature. So when you first build the pile, it should heat in 1 or 2 days when you stick your thermometer in there. If it's not heating, then you need to think about, do I need to add more nitrogen or carbon, or maybe I didn't water it enough? This is when the art form comes in. It's, play with it a little bit. It's eventually going to decompose. So don't be afraid to just play with it and add a few more things, or turn it. Make sure it didn't get compacted down too much during your mixing. So you'll see the temperature increase, and then over the days, the following days, the temperature will start to decrease. Once it gets down, I would say realistically in my life, once Saturday comes around, I would see if it's still decreasing. If it is, since I have time on Saturday, I would turn it. Whenever you see that the pile's starting to decrease in temperature, then that means the microorganisms need more water or oxygen. So you can turn it and add the water whenever it's convenient to you. Yes?
Does covering it help keep the heat in?
Does covering help keep the heat in? It's not necessary. The heat should be coming from within. Covering might keep some of the moisture in. That might help. I know John covers his worm bins worm piles with carpet, and that helps keep the water in since it's so dry here, but it's not necessary. And covering it with plastic, sometimes I've noticed it starts to smell just because the air that blows by will also increase the oxygen in the right inside the pile, so that's kind of nice. So then consecutive days, the line with diamonds on it, we could say is the second after the first turning, and the second line that you measure. So you see that the temperature rises almost as high as the first time, and then decreases, and we turn it. And then the third after the second turning is the squares, and then on down to the circles. So you see that the temperature doesn't quite get as high each time, but it's still rising. And it's still rising above the ambient outside air temperature. So whenever that line stops rising significantly, if it's rising 5 degrees above ambient, that's really not much. There's really not much going on. Then you can recognize that most of your hot composting microorganisms have done their job. And now the medium temperature, the kind of ambient air temperature microorganisms are going to start curing your pile, and they also add some benefits. I'll show you in a second. Does anyone have questions about this graph? It's pretty easy. Yeah.
If you have worms in there, you would cook them.
Right. If you have worms in here, you would cook them. So you want to think about this a little bit differently if you're doing worm compost. You can either pre-compost it like this to get the hot out, to get the heat out, and then feed it to the worms, or you can have a big enough worm pile, worm windrow or worm bin, where the worms have a place to escape to that is not heating up. So you could add your fresh to be composted material on the far left side of your bin, and the worms can move away to the right side where it's not hot. John can give you some more information on that, but you're right, worms will not like this. They will become organic matter instead of worms. So after you see that final heating, major heating rise and fall, you still want to monitor it. You want to make sure that the temperature is decreasing, and you want to make sure that the pile is still moist. If it dries out completely, then the microorganisms that are called mesophilic, which is medium temperature, they won't be able to do their job in curing. And so you keep monitoring it until you're finished with those heat cycles, and then continue on beyond that. And during the curing phase, when the temperature curve flattens out, these mid-temperature microorganisms take over, and you want to keep it moist again. And it takes about 1 to 2 months if you stop adding new materials for your pile to get to this place, so you can know when you should stop adding new stuff if you're trying to get your compost to a finished place before, say, June 1st. So why would you cure this? Why wouldn't you take your super heated 4-time compost and put it straight out on your garden? Well, if you cure it, you let it continue to sit and be treated by these medium temperature microorganisms, it'll assure your highest quality product. So your pH of your compost will move more towards neutral, which is good for the soil. It's kind of a phenomenon that when your compost sits a little bit longer, it becomes more neutral pH, which is really kind of cool. And then the soil microorganisms recolonize the pile, so that's going to help when you move that compost out into the soil. And then if there's too much carbon left in your compost pile and you put it out into your soil, then that carbon will hold on to any nitrogen in your soil, because that carbon is wanting to decompose. And we've now learned that it takes both of those ingredients, carbon and nitrogen, to decompose. So you don't want to tie up any of your nitrogen to the carbon that's left in your compost bin. So curing helps with that. And then this makes compost the best for optimum growth. It changes the nutrients to a plant available form. So I'm going to go through this really quick because I want to make sure we have time for questions. When is my compost done? Again, after the heating cycle stops and you've cured it for 1 to 2 months, and you want your compost to be look like materials. You don't want big chunks of stuff still in it. That's kind of a no-brainer. You want it to smell, have that earthy smell. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? That's a microorganism that's in the soil that is called an actinomycete, and they have this finished compost smell, so they're kind of a indicator that it's done. And then if you're a data person, there's this great maturity test that's available online at Woods End Laboratory. There's a website down there below, and it's only a few bucks, and it's a little color changing chart that'll show you how finished your compost is. And I suggest doing this once or twice before, so you know what the process looks like, and then you don't have to do it anymore if you're going to continue to follow that process. I've kind of gone over this. When do you know how do you do this when you're going to add kitchen scraps every week? Basically, you build that lasagna layer, you add your carbon, you add your nitrogen, and you keep adding it, right? Because we all keep eating in from the kitchen. Eventually, the stuff on the bottom is going to be what's finished. So you pretty much have to dig out that bottom good stuff and then recompost the stuff that's on top. So it's a little more work unless you want to have a second bin. If you want to do a second bin, you can stop adding to the first one, let it complete its compost cycle, and then it will be finished and you can be adding to the second one. That's probably the easiest. So now what? We all know we have compost. It's a great soil amendment. It contains nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients. And the nitrogen is released slowly, so it tends to mimic what the plants need over time. It's typically safe to apply 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compost on your soil if you know it's finished compost, and then mix it in. Either dig it in, till it in. That's a pretty good ratio. About 10% of a soil should be compost if you're making like a potting mix. More is not always better because it's really dense stuff, and plant roots need oxygen as well in the pores of soil. And since I'm a soil scientist, I have to say this at least once. You should test your soil and send your compost in with your soil sample, and then the lab will tell you what your soil needs and what your compost provides. Then it's some simple little math and you can have the most amazing garden. So that's available at some labs around here. I'd be happy to tell you afterwards which ones I like. And think about compost as a long-term application for your garden. Only a little bit of your compost nitrogen and nutrients are going to be available in the first year, but then what's left is going to be available in the next couple of years. So if you add compost each year, it's like putting money in a savings account. So you're going to add up your nitrogen over time, and that'll help your plants. And again, if you have questions, sample your soil and you'll know what's there. If you're having trouble troubleshooting, again, that website that I gave in the beginning is repeated here. It has great information on troubleshooting. If it's not heating, you might need to add water, oxygen. If it smells bad, you probably need to turn it. It needs more oxygen. And there are plenty other creative things that can go wrong, but they can be fixed really quick. Does anyone have any questions?
Is that okay?
The question is, can you use moldy old grass clippings in a compost pile? Absolutely.
Okay.
The microorganisms actually eat the yucky stuff on the materials that we put in there, so they're eating the mold. The challenge with grass clippings, again, is make sure it's mixed up really well. So there are a few pockets of matted down grass, but that's great stuff and it's good nitrogen. And the smell will go away once oxygen is introduced. It just might be stinky for a little bit. The question is, what do you do about fruit flies? I've noticed that I get fruit flies in my pile when it's too wet or when I don't have enough carbon. So you're right, maybe you're adding a lot of kitchen scraps and not very much brown leaves or cardboard. I would try and balance that out and see if they go away. Also, when I've had a worm bin inside my house when I was in college and didn't have a garage, I had fruit flies, and I noticed that if I froze my banana peels and my citrus and then defrosted them before I put them in my worm bin, then I had a lot less chance of getting fruit flies because they tend to be in the skins. So if it's that big of a deal, that's something I used, but it was more for indoors. Shredded paper is a good source for carbon. My challenge with outdoors is it blows away pretty easy. So you want to make sure that you have either a piece of carpet or something, a textile covering it so it doesn't go anywhere. Also, if you dump a huge garbage bag of shredded documents into your compost bin, again, it might act like matted grass. It's going to mat out on itself, so make sure it's mixed up really well so it's combined with the other nutrients and sources. But it's no one's going to find your Social Security number in there. I would like to hear other people's opinion. I don't think shiny paper is a challenge. I see it decompose nicely. It's better, the soil, it cleans things up. What do you think?
The shiny magazine paper is still being coated with cadmium. Other than that, yeah, it's the magazine papers, but all the other the other inks, those kind of things, they're all soy-based inks since basically the early 80s. So you don't have to worry about the inks. It's the shiny stuff from magazines that is still being coated with cadmium to make it shiny.
So take that however you want. The question is, do you start the process at a certain time of the year and let it do its thing during the winter? I don't tend to build a pile all at once because I add to my pile every third day with a bucket of compost from my kitchen. So I try to start my new pile when it's like right now, in the early spring, because it'll be nice for quite a few months, and I'll be going out there happily and turning it and watering it and processing it. But then during the winter time, I tend to mix it up really good, add a bunch of leaves. I tend to go get some manure or some other kind of nitrogen-rich material right before I know it's going to be really cold, and get it right where I want it, and then kind of just let winter happen. You know, some people who are super avid composters or who have something like horse manure that they need to continue processing, they will be out there in the winter, all winter long, making compost. But for me, my backyard, I tend to have a big old trash bag of leaves, and during the winter, will throw my kitchen scraps on and then put leaves on it, and just kind of let it be left alone during the winter, and then in early spring, I fix it. I turn it, and I might start a second bin if that bin hasn't decomposed enough. Again, it's an art. How much do you want to work with it? If you want to use worms, they do all the turning for you, but you have to manage them a little bit differently. I have had experience with the Soil Saver, which is the tall square one, and that one works really well. The challenge I've seen with that is you have to be able to mix it down low. You're going to dump your materials in there, and they're going to go to the bottom, and then so that might be your kitchen scraps, and then you're going to add leaves on top of that. You need to make sure they're mixed. So what I started doing is dumping my kitchen scraps and my leaves into a wheelbarrow and getting those the right moisture level, and then putting that mixture into that Soil Saver. I almost busted my tooth out once trying to mix it in there, and I popped up and I thought, I shouldn't be mixing it this way, and wheelbarrow worked better. But it works great, it composts great, and it's real tidy, so there aren't critters out there. I haven't used this green one, but it turns, right, on an axis. I would kind of say the same thing, just you need to make sure that your carbon-nitrogen ratio is right. I think a lot of us want to just throw our kitchen scraps in and not think about anything else. And you have to make sure that it's not too wet and that you're adding some benign material. I've done it too, it's real easy. So make sure you're adding those leaves so that it can mix up in there. And every once in a while you have to stick your hand down in there and pull something out and say, what is it doing? Does it look right? Does it not look right? Does it smell bad? I think all of these would work great based on your backyard situation. You just have to make sure you're managing those properties. The one that spins here on the axis that's circular, that one I've heard that you need to turn it sometimes yourself, like stick a fork in there and just flip it over, because sometimes the material will rotate along the edge and it won't actually flip on itself. But I think, again, if that was a full container of the right mixture, it would tumble like it's supposed to. You know, I haven't really used one before. I'm sure it's just a bag of microorganisms. It can't hurt anything, and it might help the process go a little faster. I would be interested in you coming back and telling us what you think. Yeah. Did someone have a question over here? Dog waste, cat waste. We don't want to put any of that in our compost pile if that compost finished product is going to go on anything we eat. So I have a dog, and I tend to put her waste in a pile, like in the corner of the yard, and I cover it with leaves. I just, pick up poop how often? Once a month, really? And then I put that pile in the corner and then cover it with some leaves and water it with a watering can, and basically it just disintegrates, but it's along my lilacs. So I will never plant carrots there. I will never plant lettuce there. I will never eat anything from it. So don't confuse the two. Thank you for your attention, and happy composting.
I'd like to welcome everybody to our first annual Composting and Gardening Festival. This is the Get Down and Dirty. It's an opportunity for community members here in Fort Collins, as well as the city of Fort Collins, to get together and learn about composting and gardening, have an opportunity to mingle with local businesses and organizations in a really nice environment. The gardens is a beautiful place to gather.
Organic material still makes up at least 30% of the waste stream from our community. The City Council is interested in accomplishing a goal that was set to divert 50% of the community's waste stream from landfill disposal, and being able to get the compostable material out of the waste stream is a really important part of accomplishing that goal.
Trash companies get about 2 miles a gallon on their garbage trucks. So if you're able to do a composting system at home, it will save on how much you throw away, and maybe you can have your trash picked up less often. You can use what you then wasted into a garden to create more food or to create plants.
Composting is the breakdown of organic matter, or the decomposition of organic matter. Everything rots, you know how rotting things, we're just managing that rotting system, whether it be composting or vermicomposting.
Can just go as simple as digging a hole in the ground and putting your vegetable scraps or your garden material in there. We have some bins that kind of help speed that process up and make it a little more contained. And you can enter yard waste such as garden leaves and grass clippings. You try to mix layers of brown, like dead leaves, and green, which it could be kitchen waste or grass clippings, and soil. You want to balance out the carbon, which is brown material, and nitrogen, which is green, and then the microbes are entered from the soil. And you can either naturally have worms that'll come up from the soil, or you can actually purchase red wrigglers and put them in there, and they also help break down. It'll slow down, of course, in the winters we get our cold. It'll start back up in the spring, and then usually by May it's ready to introduce into the garden. It introduces nutrients, including micronutrients that are very beneficial to vegetables, other plants. Just the best way to go, I think. A lot better than introducing chemical fertilizer.
This is the type of bin John Anderson uses, who's an expert vermiculturist.
I'm using worms because I'm lazy. There's 4,400 different kinds of worms. Some live in the soil and go very deep. They'll move 10 tons of soil in irrigated land in a season, 10 tons of soil per acre. And we have the epidemic species is the composting worm, lives on top. They don't even burrow into the soil. I use them because they eat so much organic matter. You can get up to 1,000 worms or better per square foot, and they'll eat half their own weight every day. That's cardboard. It's a bedding that I use. They love cardboard. They need a carbon source, not just food waste. All you gotta do is cover it so it stays dark and wet. That's the beginning. It's got the cocoons, the babies, the bedding. They have to be bedded, and the bedding's a carbon source. And that could be leaves or straw or sawdust. And then you add food waste to that. Rather than building something out of materials old or new, I'll take old refrigerators and convert them into worm bins. They work really well, they're insulated, they last for years. There's baby worms in there, there's cocoons, there's a bunch of adults. See, that's manure, and it don't smell. See that?
Yeah. Wow, wow, wow.
That's a cocoon. Yeah, they almost look like seeds. Yeah. And they can lay 3 or 4 of those a week, and there'll be 2 to 4 of those on average babies come out.
People have a lot of interest in ways to divert their organic material, and especially in the fall, people have a lot of leaves from their trees that they're trying to figure out how to get composted. So a couple of years ago, we started something called the Leaf Exchange, and it's a Yahoo subscription program that you can sign up and either get rid of the leaves that you're generating and bagging up, from your trees, or if you're interested in getting leaves, for instance, if you like to use leaves in your composting project in your backyard, or if you're an organic gardener, it's a way for people to be in touch with each other and give them and get them, as we say.
When we're told to be good stewards of the earth, I think one of the things we often overlook, especially in Western culture, is taking care of our bodies. We'll be as good a caretakers of the earth as we are of our bodies, and vice versa.
Over half of residential water use goes to landscape watering. Xeriscape is a thoughtful approach of using lower water using plants, maybe minimizing the amount of turf that you have in your yard. Well, there's 7 principles of xeriscape, and one of them is to amend the soil. So what we recommend is to put a minimum of 3 cubic yards of organic matter, compost, into your soil and rototill it in deep before you start planting your xeriscape garden. And xeriscape can be colorful and green, and it's one area that we can reduce the amount of water that we use and not really affect our lifestyle.
Even though Americans make up only 4.6% of the world's population, we use 39% of the world's newsprint and 38% of the world's computers, for example. Also, 33% of the world's plastic. So reducing is the best thing we can all do. If we can reduce the amount of waste we create in the first place, that's the #1 thing we can try to do. So in your daily lives, just think about how you can maybe buy less stuff, throw less stuff away. If you have curbside recycling, you can put all sorts of things in your curbside bin. And if you don't have curbside recycling, you can bring that stuff to us at the Larimer County Recycling Center. And the City of Fort Collins also has a drop-off on Riverside Road near Riverside and Prospect.
We are community-supported agriculture. You sign up at the beginning of the year and you get a share of the harvest each week throughout the summer, from May until around the end of October. Buying local is a growing phenomenon. You get fresh, delicious produce right at its peak.
We're the Friends of the Gardens on Spring Creek. We're the fundraising arm, and we hope to break ground on the Garden of Eden, the fruit and vegetable garden. We'll have instruction on how to grow vegetables, how to cook vegetables. We'll have fruits. We have an outdoor kitchen planned. International garden. It'll be a great space for everybody to come and enjoy.
I'm really excited to be introducing Grow Food Not Lawns. Our bottom line is in growing healthy, living soils that are free of hormones and antibiotics and toxics and heavy metals. The demand is going up for organic foods 25% a year. Currently in this country, we're unable to meet that demand. When we consider that most of the food that goes into our mouth on average travels 1,500 miles, you can see that there's a problem there. And the only way to really assure safe and quality foods is to grow them ourselves. As we begin to relocalize our food supply, our sustainability goes up, up, up.
We're selling the green cone for the first time this year at the compost bin sale. It's designed specifically for food waste. It's called a food digester.
And the green cone is what we consider to be a companion to a composter, not a competitor to a composter. This is meant strictly for food waste, but it's meant for any and all of your food waste. So you can put things that you typically wouldn't consider compostable in here. You can put your meats in here, dairies, oils, bones. You can put cooked foods in here. A lot of people don't realize that using a garbage disposal is actually not very environmentally friendly at all. You use a lot of water when you flush things down your drain. You use extra electricity. It digests the food very quickly into the soil. You get very nutrient-rich soil, several feet in any direction around where you have this installed. So it's really a very nice complementary piece to whatever type of composting that you do already, or if you're not a composting type person, it's a good alternative to putting your food in the trash or down the drain.
If you're interested in learning more about composting or recycling, check out the fcgov.com/recycling. We hope to see you here next year.